The Trump Soho has this amazingly troubled history. And it turns out that the Trump Soho is really one of the assets that's at the center of special counsel Mueller's investigation into the Trump-Russia conspiracy, but also into the Trump organization writ large.
As if President Trump didn't already have enough to fume about, a grassroots campaign recently stripped him of millions of dollars of quarterly income derived from a property that had been known as Trump Soho.
State pension funds, who are fiduciaries who have obligations to protect the retirees and the beneficiaries of state workers, police officers, firefighters, nurses, those types of people. They invest in private equity funds. And what happened here is that CalPERS, New York State Common Retirement Fund, 9 other state and local pension funds invested in a private equity fund called CIM Fund 3. And that private equity fund ended up taking over the Trump Soho Hotel in 2015 through foreclosure. So under the terms of the agreement that the private equity fund came to when they bought Trump Soho, they agreed to continue paying the Trump organization millions in fees to market and manage the Trump Soho. You have state pension funds like CalPERS and New York State who are paying millions in fees to the private equity fund every quarter, and then the private equity fund is turning around and paying that money directly to the Trump organization. President Trump reported on his June 2017 financial disclosures that he received over $2.8 million in income from that particular Trump organization. The reason that Free Speech for People got involved there is because the framers and the founders of the United States were very concerned about self-dealing and corruption. The framers were absolutely obsessed with the problems that you raised, which is that it's very easy for people who are corrupt to amass power. And so they really wanted to make sure that the Constitution had safeguards to prevent that from happening. So there's a clause in the Constitution called the Domestic Emoluments Clause. And what that says is that neither the United States nor any of the states individually can compensate or provide a profit to the president other than the salary that he's provided for serving as president. And so we thought it was a pretty easy case for the pension funds to understand why the investment in a fund that was then using fees that were being paid to pay the president was illegal and was something that they needed to take action on. Unfortunately, when we sent letters to the pension funds calling this to their attention, they didn't respond in the way that we expected. They essentially said, it's not a direct contract with the president, and we don't know what happens to the fees that we pay to the private equity fund. All we're concerned about is whether or not we get a good return on investment. And so we started a campaign called Divest Trump Soho. Thousands of people signed a petition calling on the state pension funds to consider divestment. And we had several back and forths with the pension funds offering different types of remedies that would help them to really extricate themselves and their pensioners from this illegal scheme. One of those would have been to divest completely from the fund. But another option that we put on the table was for them to engage with the private equity fund manager to terminate the agreement with the Trump organization. So after months of back and forth, thousands of people writing in, several people actually showing up at the board meetings of the CalPERS pension fund, and Representative Ted Lieu from California leading 11 of his colleagues in filing a letter with CalPERS calling on them to take action. Now the private equity fund manager is buying out the Trump organization and taking the Trump name off of Trump Soho.
I saw the letter that members of Congress sent, and they talk about legal, fiduciary, and ethical obligations. And this violation of the Constitution that you mentioned, isn't that really Trump's violation of the Constitution, not these hedge fund managers? I mean, Trump chose not to divest, as all other presidents have done, from his businesses. How were you able to convince them that they were in violation of the Constitution?
Well, we'll never actually hear from the hedge fund that they were violating the Constitution. So I should be clear about that. It's clear that President Trump is prohibited from receiving those funds. And the thing that we were hanging our arguments on is the fact that the pension funds have, as we said, legal and ethical obligations that meant that they needed to stop being a part of this illegal scheme. Pension funds have broad discretion in how they invest their funds, but that discretion only goes up to the limits of the law. So what would happen if CalPERS had invested in a private equity fund and it turned out that one of the assets that was held in that fund was found to be laundering money? You wouldn't want the pension fund to stay in that investment, even if they were getting a good return, because it was violating the law.
Well, that's not a hypothetical.
And it's not this is the thing. So here's the issue. So the domestic emoluments clause is what brought us to this case, but the Trump Soho has this amazingly troubled history. And it turns out that the Trump Soho is really one of the assets that's at the center of Special Counsel Mueller's investigation into the Trump-Russia conspiracy, but also into the Trump organization writ large. The Trump Soho was announced at the end of the 2007 season of The Apprentice, and it was really supposed to be Donald Jr. and Ivanka's first foray into taking over the brand. They came up with this co-developing group. It included a firm called Bayrock and another firm called Saper. And one of the principals involved in this was a man named Felix Sater.
Yeah.
So Felix Sater turns out to be the guy who sent an email to one of Trump's attorneys saying, our boy can be president and we can make it happen. I'll get Putin's people in line on this. So that is one of the co-developers of the Trump Soho. Now that's only one piece of the story though, because it turns out 2008, as you may remember, wasn't a great time to be selling real estate. And that was around the time that they were taking Trump Soho to market. And so there were claims from some of the people who had purchased condo units there that Donald Jr. and Ivanka and other members of the Trump organization had fraudulently told them that more units had been sold than was actually the case, and that they had inflated the value of those units. And so that civil fraud case was going on in much of 2010 and 2011.
Wait, hypothetically, what would happen if they just made some campaign contributions to the Manhattan prosecutor and those charges just went away? Would they be home free, or are there other levels of enforcement that could come after them?
That's a great hypothetical that you ask. So I was talking about the civil case, and what happened in the civil case was that the Trump organization paid the plaintiffs in the civil case to drop their suit.
Okay.
But the Manhattan District Attorney's Office was actually investigating to determine whether or not criminal fraud had occurred in this case. And it turns out, based on great reporting that was done by the New Yorker and ProPublica, that Mark Kasowitz, who is a longtime Trump attorney, had donated money just before and just after the criminal investigation was dropped by Manhattan DA Cyrus Vance. There have been a lot of questions raised about whether that donation to the Manhattan DA was actually an attempt at bribery to get him to drop the criminal fraud case. So you can see that it's not just the domestic emoluments clause here that makes you wonder about what a state pension fund is doing remaining invested in a property like this. And that's not the end of it. So the Financial Times, which is a really well-known London paper, did an in-depth investigation of whether or not someone who had ties to the Kazakhstan government, an oligarch essentially in Kazakhstan, was laundering money through Trump Soho units. And they essentially concluded that the former energy minister from Kazakhstan had purchased 3 Trump Soho units to launder money that he had illegally gotten in Kazakhstan.
Stolen from his government?
Stolen from his government.
Yeah.
And so that's yet another reason that the Mueller investigation has really been taking a close look at Trump Soho.
Now let's just explain about money laundering. So when you have this sort of kleptocracy, like the Russian Federation, I guess Kazakhstan seems to be one, where the government and organized crime is basically one entity. For some reason, they come to people like Trump to launder their money so that who won't know? Like, who do they even have to worry about? If they have money that they've stolen from the people, from the government, who do they have to fool?
Right. Well, in the case of Kazakhstan, there were governments in transition. So
Okay.
he was a former energy minister fleeing the country. So he needed to get his money out of Kazakhstan and into some other vehicle. And the way that he did that was allegedly to purchase Soho condominium units. In the case of folks in the Russian Federation, it depends. They may be businessmen who are operating not only in Russia, but also in other nations.
Okay, so then they would be liable and under the justice systems of those nations.
Right,
Okay. That's why they money launder.
right.
I see. 'Cause
Or it may be that they're, if it's if it's the Russian organized crime, then even in Russia, some of the stuff that they're doing is not legal. In that
if
case,
you're not a friend of Putin's,
right,
you could actually
you
be...
could actually end up in trouble.
You could get in trouble. Okay,
Yeah.
okay. Ashley Avery says, thank you for putting your time into this for all of us, and she gives a little heart symbol. She also had a question. Is there any situation where any of Trump's assets could be seized? I don't know. It would just make me kind of happy.
So there is, we have something called the forfeiture laws or provisions. So what that means is that when an asset is being used in furtherance of a crime, the DOJ or the police, whoever is the person prosecuting that crime, can take that asset. So it is possible that, if Special Counsel Mueller determines that there was money laundering taking place or that money laundering is taking place at Trump Soho, that asset could end up being forfeited to the federal government. Now, whether or not that will happen, criminal investigations can take a very long amount of time, but it certainly would you would think, make someone who is a private equity fund nervous about whether or not it could end up being forfeited to the government.